Drum brakes have a bad rap in the industry. One is because they do have problems with brake fade, but a drum brake is not an obsolete technology. It's actually still in use in heavy-duty semi-trucks. The problem is when you put them on a muscle car or a track car, is they get hot really fast and they don't have a good way of dissipating the heat like a vented and drilled and slotted rotor does. And then you'll end up with what's called brake fade, and you'll step on the pedal and nothing will happen and you'll hit the wall. On the loose change Camaro, we decided to go with some Wilwood brakes. And Wilwood makes a kit that basically fits our Detroit Speed subframe, since the Detroit Speed subframe uses a modified C-5 Corvette spindle. So what we got was a 6-piston, 14¼ inch big brake kit that's basically a bolt-on for the Corvette, which made installation on the Detroit Speed subframe really straightforward and simple. The 14¼ inch rotors come with black E-coat on them, and they do this for a couple reasons. One is it keeps the rotor looking nice so that the non-swept area doesn't get rusty over time. The other thing is it just gives them a nice protection so that when they're in the box, they don't get scratched up as bad, they don't rust in the box, and then it helps with what they call the bedding in process, which the average person might call breaking in, where you get the pads and the rotors seated so they're matched together and provide the most bite. When I opened the boxes the Wilwood rotors came in, the first thing that really strikes you is how big these things are. It's 14¼ inches sounds big, but when you see it, it really hits home, especially when you consider the 69 Camaro that came with disc brakes from the factory probably had a 9½ or 10-inch rotor. Makes these things look even more massive. We chose to go with Wilwood's 6-piston calipers, and what's significant about a 6-piston caliper is nothing like pistons in an engine. The original caliper that came on a 69 Camaro was probably 2½ inches in diameter. It was what sounds like really big, but it only pushed on one side and then the caliper moved physically to clamp the brakes down. The advantage of 6 pistons is that even though the pistons themselves are smaller, you're able to get more surface area because you've got more pistons. And you can also spread them out over a larger pad, and therefore you can get more clamping force onto that pad to slow the rotor down. The loose change Camaro has C-5 Corvette spindles on it. This allowed us to order a Wilwood disc brake kit for a C-5 Corvette, which makes installation really easy. All the parts are designed to bolt onto the Corvette, so we just followed the basic instructions for the Corvette installation. First thing you do is you install the bracket, and there's a little bit of trickiness to that. You've got to put some shims in it, and they recommend you start with 2 shims because later on you'll have to use a gauge to check clearances. The next thing you need to do is assemble the rotor and the rotor hat. The rotor hat is actually made of aluminum to save some weight, and that also helps dissipate heat when you're really beating on the brakes.
You'll dissipate the heat from this rotor into this aluminum hat, and that aluminum hat is going to be your heat sink, and it's also going to scrub a little bit of weight off of it. And weight is a big deal when you're trying to save weight on a car. You can do it through the brake system usually.
Basically you just line the holes up and you put the special drilled bolts in, and you torque them all the way around to 180 inch-pounds. The twisted wires you see on the back of the rotors are safety wires, and the basic purpose of safety wires is to prevent the rotor hat bolts from coming loose. This is accomplished by the wires pulling on each bolt in an opposing direction. So if one bolt tries to turn counterclockwise and come loose, it forces the other bolts to try and turn clockwise and tighten, which obviously isn't going to happen. So there's no way that the bolts could ever come out unless the safety wire physically broke. Safety wiring isn't very difficult. There are actually special pairs of pliers made for twisting the wire. However, you can do it with a regular pair of slip joint or channel lock pliers and just take your time, which is what we demonstrated. Safety wire is a special type of wire. It's made of stainless steel, and it has a specific hardness so that when you twist it, it doesn't become brittle and break. And that also maintains its strength during high heat situations, because safety wire can be used on anything from brakes to reciprocating parts in a high performance engine. And they even give you some nice instructions on how to properly safety wire something. It's important when you're doing these to get the rotor tightened down, because you got to measure all the gaps around the pads and the caliper, so as the brakes are used and they wear, nothing's going to rub. Installing the calipers isn't quite as simple as just dropping them on the bracket. There's 2 adjustments you need to make. One is the radial adjustment, how far the caliper is from the axle center line, and then one is the horizontal or centering adjustment, how well the caliper is centered on the rotor. Wilwood wants the rotor centering done first, so you use a feeler gauge to determine how much shim you need to add or subtract from the caliper bracket itself. And then once you've done that, the radial adjustment is accomplished because you want the pads to maintain full contact with the rotor. If the caliper was too high up, the pads may hang over the edge of the rotor and they don't have your full braking area, and you're also going to have some strange wear on the pads, possibly noise, and that's not a good thing. So what we're doing here, we've got the caliper mounted, and we've got a good old-fashioned set of feeler gauges, and what you do here is you stick the feeler between the caliper and the rotor, and as you can kind of see, this one won't fit. It fits on the other side. So that means that this caliper is not centered on the rotor, so that, like I was talking about before, if stuff wears or just driving and the stuff expands from heat and going down the road, this could rub and wear something out prematurely. So what we're going to do is we're going to shim this bracket we put on initially until this caliper is centered on the rotor. On the rear axle, we've got a similar set of Wilwood big brakes. These are 14 inches and they only have a 4-piston caliper, but the caliper looks almost identical to the floating 6-piston caliper on the front of the car. Some of this is kind of aesthetics. You don't necessarily need a 14-inch rotor on the back of the car, but it's always good to have more brake than you need than not enough brakes. The biggest advantage to running a floating caliper on the rear axle of your muscle car is the elimination of pad knockback. We're probably not going to have a whole lot of problem with that since we're running a Ford 9-inch, but if you're running most GM rear ends, they have a C-clip, which kind of loosely holds the axle in place. The reason we're concerned with pad knockback is if you were to take this car to a track, you want it to be as consistent as possible so that you can plan for every corner. And if you're coming into a corner not sure how much brakes you're really going to have, that's going to cause you to drive more cautiously, and it's going to cost you time on your lap. The reason we chose the Wilwood brake kit with the integral parking brake was because even though we're building this car to be very capable on the track, we want it to be a car you could live with if you wanted to drive it to work or take it to lunch. And since it's a manual transmission, a parking brake is kind of a necessity. You don't want to put your Camaro in first gear and somebody leans in it to grab something out, hits the shifter, and there it goes down a hill into a wall. Installing the Wilwood brakes on the Curry 9-inch is pretty straightforward. The biggest challenge is cutting the supplied axle retaining bracket off of the Curry axles so that you can use the supplied bracket for the Wilwood parking brake. Before installing the axle into the housing, it's important to put a little bit of grease on the splines and on the outside of the bearing so that when you go to put it all together, it just slides in a little easier. The next part is kind of tricky. It's difficult to hold the parking brake assembly and the axle retaining bracket and slide the T-bolts to the back and then attempt to put the nut on through the one hole they give you in the axle flange. But it's not really difficult. You just need to be patient because everybody drops the bracket or drops a nut and gets a little mad. Once the parking brake has been installed on the axle, the next thing you need to do is install the spacer and the caliper bracket. Once you've assembled the rotor and hung it on the axle, it's time to make the same clearance checks on the caliper that we did on the front, just ensuring that the caliper is centered on the rotor and that the radial adjustment is correct so you have full pad contact on the rotor. For most people, now would be the time to make your brake lines, but since we're not quite to that step in this process, we'll be doing a full custom brake line set later on in the build. Once you've got your brakes assembled and all the lines bled, it's important to note that you don't want to just get in the car and stomp on the pedal. There's actually what's called a bedding in procedure, and you can learn more about that at Wilwood's website.